Uh, Professor Pogge, are you there? Mhm.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay.
Okay. Am I audible?
Yes, definitely.
So let's begin. So, hello everyone. I, Mohammed Siddiqui, on behalf of JNU Lecture Series, warmly welcome you all to this exciting lecture with the exciting professor. It is truly a matter of immense honor and joy for all of us here at the JNU Lecture Series to welcome Professor Thomas Pogge, one of the most influential philosophers of our time. Professor Pogge currently serves as the professor of philosophy and international affairs at the Yale University and is the director of the Global Justice Program, where he has led some of the most groundbreaking conversations on global poverty, institutional design, and international moral responsibility. His work spanning world poverty and human rights, the Health Impact Fund, and his contributions to questions of justice beyond borders has profoundly shaped how students, scholars, policymakers, and activists think about the ethical foundation of the global order. For many of us here, especially students of political science and philosophy, Professor Pogge has not merely been an academic figure, but a guiding intellectual presence. His writings have traveled deep into the classroom across India and have become an inseparable part of our academic upbringing. It is no exaggeration to say that India, and particularly its students' community, holds a deep admiration for his work. Generations of students preparing for university entrance exams, civil services, and research careers have engaged with Professor Pogge's ideas on global justice, ideas that have pushed us to rethink the morality of our institutions and the structures we take for granted. In fact, on a personal note, I still vividly remember appearing for the common university entrance test, where one of the questions on global justice mentioned Professor Pogge as an option. I chose him as the correct answer, and that one mark given for selecting that right thinker feels even more meaningful today as we sit together for an interactive discussion with the very person whose ideas shaped our answer sheets, our academic journeys, and our understanding for justice itself. It is a surreal feeling, something we never imagined possible, that the scholar we studied for exam is now here with us as a part of a conversation. Today's lecture, Structure for a Free Society, could not be more timely given the context in which freedom is constantly negotiated between markets and morality, democracy and inequality, rights and responsibilities, and global institutions and local realities. How do we create social, political, and economic structures that not only protect individual freedom but expand them, especially for the most marginalized? How do we ensure that justice is not an abstract ideal but an institutional reality? India, too, is at a pivotal moment debating issues of social justice, distributive fairness, welfare, institutional reform, and global interdependence. Professor Pogge's framework on how institutional structures shape life chances across societies offers us a powerful lens through which to understand these transformations. Whether we speak of poverty, healthcare systems, democratic institutions, or global trade regimes, his insights helps us grasp how deeply structure and justice are intertwined. In today's climate, where inequalities are widening, global cooperation is weakening, and the idea of freedom itself is contested, his reflections hold immense relevance. We are deeply grateful, humbled, and genuinely excited to learn from you today. Professor Pogge, thank you for giving us this rare opportunity to engage with you directly. It is a moment of privilege to all of us at the JNU lecture series, one of that we will remember for a very long time. Over to you, Professor Pogge.
Okay, thank you very much for this generous introduction, and I hope it will not be so rare. I hope to be in India more often now in the near future, and hope to then see you in person, interact with you in person. Anyway, I will share my screen, and I have a PowerPoint presentation. Can you give me privileges? Right. Good. Can you see my screen? Can you see the screen? Okay, let's just assume you are seeing it. Good. And you already mentioned why I am interested in the topic of freedom, because there is now a groundswell of political movement in the direction of free market societies, greater inequality, less interference by the state, and so on. And I want to help reclaim the concept of freedom and clarify it a little bit and mobilize it for resistance against this movement. I've just been to Argentina, giving a similar lecture there. And that obviously is one of the places where, under the heading of freedom, a lot of mischief is being done. Okay, so let's start with the table of contents. I will talk in 3 chapters, at first about freedom, then about poverty, and finally about innovation. Starting with freedom, we ask the question, how should a society be structured to realize a widely shareable ideal of freedom? By a society, I mean a potentially self-sufficient association of persons, such as a state, a grouping of states like the European Union, or humanity at large. And by the structure of a society, I mean, first of all, its institutional arrangements, the rules, roles, rights, and procedures typically encoded in law. Secondly, its social and cultural practices, customs, and habits. Third, its material infrastructure, which provides transportation, energy, shipping, communications, and so on. And finally, what's often called land use, the material environment as it's continually modified by people's interactions with it through settlements, agriculture, mining, pollution, rivers and canals, parks, forests, coastlines. All these structures have profound effects on human beings, on their life chances, on the distribution of benefits and burdens. And so we have to think about these structures in order, sort of under the heading of justice. Now, freedom, that is the value that I will focus on today. Human beings, we agree, ought to live free, self-directed lives, which requires meaningful options to choose from, immediate conduct options to freedom of movement, worship, or freedom of speech, the larger freedom to direct one's own life, freedom of association, freedom to choose a profession or religion, and then freedom to shape, typically with others, one's social and material environment, which I call formative freedom. The freedom of all human beings matters, and matters equally. And I will here focus on freedom exclusively, leaving open what other values also deserve. Now, in a state of nature, says Hobbes, every man has a right to everything, even to one another's body. That may seem to give you a great deal of freedom, the maximum amount of freedom, But in reality, such a condition offers very little real freedom because persons are severely constrained by expectable interference from others. So a state of nature, as Hobbes points out, is one of continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So clearly, what matters is freedom that is securely enjoyed or exercised, that is to say, real freedom. And real freedom requires that we constrain the freedom of people in order to protect the freedom of those same people. People's freedom has to be constrained to be meaningful. So examples, very obvious: freedom from arbitrary imprisonment, freedom from violence or from interference with one's property, requires effective suppression of freedoms to assault or to imprison others or to use their property without their consent. Now, the formulation of constraints requires balancing various candidate freedoms in terms of a widely shareable conception of their value. So we have to have some idea of the value of different freedoms in order to be able to trade them off. But we also need social science data so that we can assess the real cost of granting a specific candidate freedom in terms of other candidate freedoms. We have to find out how much more often some freedom would actually be used and how costly these extra uses would be in terms of others' freedoms. So, for example, with the speed limit, right? A speed limit restricts the freedom of people to drive very fast, but whether that restriction is worth it and how strongly it should be restricted should depend on what the actual impact would be of greater or lesser restrictions. How many people would travel at higher speeds if the speed limit were higher? And how much would that interfere with the freedom of other people, for example, by causing accidents that additional traffic accidents that would hurt people or kill people? Now, real freedom is competitive. It's competitive across freedoms, as we have just seen, and it's also competitive across persons, as is most clearly demonstrated in the case of formative freedom. So in the case of formative freedom, if some people have greater influence on how our society is governed and structured, then other people must have less influence. There are two obvious reasons against large inequalities in formative freedom. One is that formative freedom has diminishing marginal value. The first bit of formative freedom, namely that one is involved in deliberations, has a voice, has a role in collective decision-making. That first bit of freedom is very important, and then having a greater or disproportionate role becomes less and less important. That's sort of a broadly speaking consequentialist argument for avoiding inequalities in formative freedom. The other argument is more of a Kantian or deontological nature, where you say, point to lack of universalizability. Nobody ought to claim any freedom that is incompatible with a like freedom enjoyed by others. I should not want to have a freedom of action that could not at the same time be conceded to others as well. So here, any disproportionate freedom, formative freedom in shaping the conditions under which we all live is morally suspect. So that would suggest that everyone's judgment and will in regard to common decisions should matter in settling common affairs and should matter roughly equally. And that's the basic idea of democracy. We implement that in the political system, but of course, we should also implement that in other avenues of decision-making, such as the economic system. Now, one very important point is that real freedom is not constant sum. We have technological and social innovation that leads to human beings enjoying vastly greater real freedom now than in the past. that we have more options. We have an expanded menu of products, for example, many products that didn't exist or that weren't available and accessible in earlier times. Choice of professions, different infrastructure options. You can go by plane to, for example, so it's possible for me to visit India relatively comfortably rather than having to travel overland for many months to get there. We have not only more options, but also better options, a richer, more diverse menu of more highly valued options. And we have whole new option spaces in which we can move around. For example, video games, we can enter a video game and have options within that game. We can enter the prediction markets and open an account and be a player in that space. And there's the whole world of corporations, these artificial creatures that are inhabiting our economy, and we can play in that world. So freedom, real freedom isn't constant sum, but human progress, a very important aspect of it, is increasing real freedom for many, and not necessarily for all, but for many of us. So key preliminary conclusions here. Drawing on social science data, we should structure society to optimize the real freedom that is enjoyed in it. Here, the freedom of every person should count equally. That's a fundamental principle of morality, that all human beings count and count equally. More highly valued freedoms, such as freedom from violence and freedom to access necessities, should weigh more heavily. So we should have a dimension of value in which we assess different freedoms. Greater weight should be given to those who enjoy less real freedom. That is an equalizing idea that we should, justify, as I said, by decreasing marginal utility and also by Kantian considerations of universalizability. So we should not be indifferent to how freedom is distributed, but rather we should pay more attention to those with the least freedom. And finally, and importantly, a key aim should always be to structure society for progress, progress in freedom, to facilitate technological and social innovation, as well as the wide diffusion of its fruits. Now, there is some intertemporal competition in regard to freedom. Earlier exercises of freedom can have profound impacts on what freedom is actually enjoyed later on. This is true in very simple one-person cases where a person can exercise her freedom and thereby gravely curtail her own future freedom. So a person can sell herself into slavery, a person can amputate her hand and thereby enjoy much less freedom in the future. And the same happens at the social level. So exercising its formative freedom, a society's members can derail progress in freedom for some or all population segments. They can create an autocracy, organize themselves as a dictatorship, as an autocracy. They can create very large economic inequalities that then last for many decades thereafter, immiserating a large segment of the population. So here is an intertemporal competition in freedom where we have to either restrain the freedom of earlier generations in order to protect the freedom of later people, or conversely, we will have to suffer abridgments of the freedom of later people in order to allow earlier people fully to exercise their freedom. And here I think we should be biased in the direction of protecting the freedom of later people. Freedom to affect the more distant future should be severely discounted because on the one hand, it has rather low value for the people exercising it, the freedom to determine how much freedom people 100 years down the road have. That freedom has rather little value for present people. And it has very, very high cost, of course, on those future people. And that's especially so when freedom destroying choices would impose losses on non-consenting people by restricting their freedom or by slowing general progress in freedom. So we should be very careful to not give people too much freedom that would allow them to diminish the freedom of future people. No generation should be free to sabotage the freedom of its successors. Now, after these preliminary remarks on freedom, let's apply all that to what I think is the most important threat to freedom in this age and really in human history, and that is poverty. So let's talk about the so-called American century. The US folks like to use the word American when they mean themselves, the United States, but let's follow that for the moment. The so-called American century of US dominance begins with Franklin Roosevelt's famous State of the Union address of 6 January 1941. That was before Pearl Harbor, but it was already clear that the US would join the war sooner or later. And Roosevelt was here in the State of the Union address outlining his vision for the world after the war. What is American dominance, American leadership going to produce for the world? And he emphasized these 4 important freedoms, including the third one, freedom from want, which translated into world terms means economic understandings that will secure to every nation a healthy peacetime life for its inhabitants. Now, Roosevelt was very right to address poverty in terms of freedom. Poverty diminishes one's conduct options. It diminishes one's freedom to direct one's own life. And it also diminishes one's formative freedom to participate in shaping the shared social and material environment. So poverty is a tremendous burden, a tremendous threat to freedom, a great restriction of it. In our world, by far the greatest freedom deficits are linked to poverty, entailing oppression, deprivation, stress, and lack of opportunities to shape one's own life and to participate in structuring one's life world. About 30% of humanity, which is 2.5 billion people, are food insecure and unable to afford a healthy diet. That's an enormous number if you think about it. This is the distribution of global income and on a logarithmic scale. And you can see here the average income. This is the income that you need to be able to afford a healthy diet here, that red line. And you can see that about 30% of humankind are below that line. They cannot afford a healthy diet, and they have an income somewhere around $4 and something in internationally purchasing power adjusted international dollars. Now, astonishingly, the average income in the world, which you see here, is more than 10 times higher. It's somewhere around $70 per person per day, again in international dollars. And only 6% of the world's population have that average income or above. And what you can see right off this chart is that poverty, the kind of poverty that prevents you from affording a healthy diet, is today totally avoidable, right? We could very easily bring those 30% of humankind up to the level of $4 a day because the aggregate income in the world is easily large enough. Here is the statistics from the latest FAO account on world hunger and world poverty. And you can see here that over the last decade, since the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, were announced, during the last decade, things have gotten much, much worse. We have a 50% increase in the number of moderately or severely food insecure people. that number rose from 1,543 million to 2,284 million in a 10-year time span from 2014 to 2024. This is partly, I think, a result of the deadline that was set for 2030. Politicians understandably said, okay, we did a heavy lifting for the MDGs, for the Millennium Development Goals. Now we have 15 years until we would get assessed again for the Sustainable Development Goals. Let's relax for a while. Let our successors worry about achieving them. Now you will say that, okay, fine, so there wasn't much progress in the last 10 years, but over the long run, surely poverty is getting better. And yes, you are right. If you look at things in terms of population shares, what percentage of the human population live below a certain poverty line, whatever poverty line you choose. But you're not right in absolute numbers. So there are more poor people today than there were people at the end of the Second World War, for example. And as you can see here, there is a decline in percentage terms, but in absolute numbers, vast numbers of people are poor. And what I want to stress is that what really matters is not whether in the diachronic comparison, right? Are we doing better in terms of poverty? Are there fewer people severely poor now than, let's say, 50 years ago? But what really matters is the synchronic comparison, namely the comparison with what would be possible today. Since Roosevelt's speech, the global average income has quintupled. That means it went up by a factor of 5. If poor people had participated proportionately in that increase in the global average income, then severe poverty would now be completely eradicated. That is not the case, obviously. There is a huge amount of poverty still there. And that means that poor people have been left behind. They have not participated proportionately. And we are doing much, much worse in terms of poverty than would easily be doable given today's technological, administrative, and economic capabilities. So if you want to make an historical comparison, I think you would have to conclude that our generation is doing far worse than any generation in human history by allowing a much, much greater avoidable poverty to persist. Never has poverty been as easily avoidable for so many people. And that gives us a tremendous responsibility to do better than we are currently doing in terms of poverty avoidance, poverty eradication. And that is important not only for the sake of the currently poor, but it is also important for the sake of future generations, because poverty is a very great headwind against progress in freedom by wasting the creative potential of so many people. Think of all the people who today don't get an education, who live hand to mouth, barely able to get by, and think of the creative contributions they could make to humankind if only they were given a chance so to contribute, if they were given a chance to be educated and to exercise their creative talents. Human progress would progress much more quickly, and we could fill leadership positions from a much larger pool of creative and intelligent people. So big conclusion here is the importance of vast inequality in our world, the persistence of deep and widespread poverty, those 30% who cannot afford a healthy diet being the tip of that iceberg. That's not due to insufficient productivity or insufficient growth or anything like that. It's simply due to hugely excessive inequality. We had enough productivity growth over the last 60, 80 years to eradicate poverty. We just haven't done it. We have concentrated that income at the very top. we have experienced a century-long massive accumulation in economic and consequently social and political inequality internationally, intranationally, and also globally. You can see here international inequality. This is a chart that I borrowed from Branko Milanovic, and he divides the world into two main groups: the core group, as he calls it, the industrialized countries, Europe, the United States, Japan, and so on, and the periphery countries, the developing countries, with India being the most important. You have China left out of this chart. So you can see here that each of these groups of countries has its own distribution curve. And the most important fact is that the difference in median income between those two groups, they are related by a ratio of 22.6. So the core countries are 22.6 times richer at the median. The median core country inhabitants has 22.6 times as much income as the median person in the periphery countries, which again includes India. To overcome that 22.6 ratio, it would take 314 years if the periphery grew at 1% higher rate per annum than the core. If they grew at 2% higher rates, it would take 158 years. So these kinds of inequalities, they take a long time to accumulate. They have accumulated through the colonial and post-colonial period. And they would take equally long to erase again, to eradicate, obviously. Intra-national inequality has gotten worse pretty much everywhere. You can see here 1980 as the baseline. And this is from the OECD. They included Russia. They did not include India, but I've written it in at the bottom. All these countries have experienced increasing intra-national inequality as measured by the income share of the top 1%. And India is, together with Russia, at the very top of that tendency, an enormous increase in the income share of the top 1%. If you look at the top 1% wealth share, again, India is near the top in the world. It is near countries like Brazil, Latin America being notorious for high income and wealth inequalities. Indonesia is very high, Mexico, Russia, Saudi Arabia, South Africa. So very large wealth inequalities, which of course entail large inequalities in formative freedom, in the freedom to shape the structure of the country, the way the country is organized. Now, these long accumulating and self-reinforcing inequalities are often defended by appeal to freedom. So people say that this inequality has accumulated through past exercises of freedom. People have exercised their formative freedom to shape our economic systems, and people have exercised their other freedoms to influence how well particular people did within those systems. So if we believe in freedom, if we embrace freedom, we must respect the effect of these free choices, even if we sometimes don't like what these effects are, or so people say. Now, let me oppose this conclusion with some reasons against it. Some reasons derive from the earlier discussion of intertemporal competition, and we concluded there that as time passes, the weight of past exercises of freedom fades relative to the task of safeguarding freedom in the present. So we should not give a lot of weight to the freedom of people to affect the distant future, but we should rather give weight to safeguarding the freedom of people living right here and now. This is especially clear, we said, When present freedom deficits are extreme, which is, as I showed you, they are, and relative to what's unavoidable. And it's especially clear also when these freedom deficits fall on innocent parties. And that's what they do. They fall on innocent parties, such as the progeny or compatriots of those people who perhaps made improvident or unlucky choices. So we should not inflict great freedom deficits on present people on the grounds that perhaps their ancestors or compatriots in an earlier period made bad choices. Now, the second point here is that past actions to which we often make appeal, or our opponents make appeal, were illegitimate exercises of freedom. They involved unjust and often genocidal wars with subsequent colonialism and enslavement. They played a very prominent role in the emergence of today's extreme inequalities. So when you ask yourself why the average income in India is so much lower than the average income in Europe, the answer obviously is in part India's colonial history and the aftermath of that history, the great inequalities with which India started. It started way behind in 1947-48, and so was much more exploitable, played a very diminished role in international affairs, totally out of proportion to its great population, and so was heavily disadvantaged through free choices that were entirely illegitimate, the choice to invade India, to colonize India, and so on. So thanks to this history, Western states and Western corporations have been enjoying a crushing formative freedom dominance that should never have existed. That again undermines, of course, the legitimacy of the existing inequalities. So regard to our actual history supports further discounting the weight of past exercises of formative freedom. With the weight of history deflated, the claim of the living poor to a fair share of formative freedom becomes even stronger. They should be able to bring their will and judgment to bear on common concerns, on how to treat our planet, how to treat non-human species and natural resources, how to structure the world economy, how to deal with threats facing humankind, such as dangerous weapons and technologies, ecological disasters, pandemics, and so on. Why shouldn't poor people have an equal right, an equal effective right to weigh in on those questions, to decide together with everyone else how we make these formative decisions that affect humanity at large? And currently, of course, the super rich, with their crushing economic dominance, have the ability to settle such matters often unilaterally, or at least to have a very dominant role in deciding how these matters should be addressed. And again, that seems unjust, partly in light of the history of how these inequalities have emerged. Now, the avoidable persistence of poverty leaves billions of human beings very little freedom of action, makes it difficult for them to liberate themselves from deprivation, stress, and oppression, and offers them no attractive opportunities to shape their own life. It deprives the poor of their formative freedom to participate in shaping their life world, and it goes against the will and judgment of the currently marginalized, who aspire to a greater and ultimately equal formative role in structuring our world and to greater freedom of life and action. Now, how can we stem, how can we address these accumulated enormous inequalities so as to curtail extreme poverty and to bring the poor into a position where they can participate in important decisions and play a formative role forward going? Here, most discussions focus on progressive taxation and social support. We should have more taxation on the rich and more social support for the poor. And that's all well and good. I'm not against that at all. But I'm saying that that is only a small part of the spectrum of opportunities and possibilities. We often overlook other important structural features of national societies and supranational systems that also have profound effects on poverty and inequality, and hence on freedom. An example are the rules governing the exploitation of natural resources, which are now exploited basically entirely by the poor. The poor are polluting our common air, water, and soil, and the poor are arranging amongst themselves how to exploit natural resources, all the minerals that they dig up from the ground. The vast majority of humankind are not included at all in sharing the value of these resources, which is blatantly unjust. So let's talk about something else, though. Let's talk in this final chapter about innovation, how we organize in this world innovation, and how that has profound effects on perpetuating the great inequalities in freedom that we have talked about in the first two chapters. Innovation is, of course, of enormous importance for the future evolution of human freedom. I mentioned that in the freedom chapter, including the future evolution of inequality of freedom. So we have to look at what innovations are being pursued, who has opportunities to participate in innovating, and who has access to the fruits of innovation. How are these fruits of innovation diffused across the global population? Innovation requires large investments often, certainly the kind of innovations that we are making now. All the cheap and easy innovations have been made pretty much. And if you want to seriously innovate today, you need laboratories, you need a sophisticated education, and so on. So it's expensive. But because innovations have enormous payoffs that affect the entire future of humankind, they often bring even much, much larger benefits. So spending $1 billion to develop a new medicine, for example, can be very much worthwhile because of all the millions of future people that will benefit from that innovation. And so societies rightly promote the development and diffusion of important innovations. We promote R&D, and we promote, or should promote, diffusion. The way we do that, globalized through the TRIPS agreement, is patents. Patents are the preferred tool for promoting innovations, and we have a one-size-fits-all global patent regime that requires 20-year product patents that facilitate earnings from monopoly markups. Basically, innovators are granted 20-year monopoly, during which time they can decide who has the right to produce their innovation, and they can sell that right, they can license it, and thereby earn licensing fees and royalties, basically that, which then cause monopoly markups on the product. The product is a lot more expensive than it would otherwise be, because those who produce it have to pay licensing fees or royalties. Now, there are four important problematic effects of this regime. First, it leads to high prices, very large markups on products that are under patent. I give you the example of Sovaldi. Sovaldi is an important drug that addresses hepatitis C, and it came on the market in 2013 in the United States at a price that was 3,000 times the cost of production. So they sold it at $1,000 per pill, $84,000 per course of treatment. You need 84 pills, one a day, to get rid of your hepatitis C. And the product could be manufactured at 30 cents per pill. So a 30-cent pill was sold at $1,000. It was cheaper in the poorer countries, but equally unaffordable there because, of course, incomes are also lower in the poorer countries. And so the result was that 8 years later, only 7% of all the sufferers of hepatitis C around the world had been treated with Sovaldi. We had a wonderful drug, but we didn't use it to eradicate the disease. We used it to treat 7% of the sick people, namely those who could afford it. These markups constitute a strong headwind against diffusion, leading to massive underutilization with deadweight losses and the exclusion of the poor, and even in this case, of the middle class. The second problematic effect of the patent regime is that innovators will not innovate for the specific needs and interests of the poor. We know that the poor cannot pay high markups, so we just don't worry about what they may need by way of innovations. It's much more profitable to research male baldness and medicines against that than to research the diseases of poverty, such as TB, hepatitis, malaria, HIV/AIDS, measles, tropical diseases, and so on. The third big drawback is that thanks to their unjustly acquired huge superiority in financial and human capital, northern innovators are the first to reach nearly all significant innovations. So if you look at where patent grantees, patentees, where do these people come from? Which countries are patenting the most? You find this is just a few countries in the global north. China is very high up there now, as is the United States, Germany, Switzerland, just a few very rich countries that have kind of monopoly on monopolizing. And this in turn leads to very large south-north flows of money. So the patent system produces big flows of money from those who take out licenses and royalties to those who receive the money. And these flows go south to north, from poor countries to rich countries. And that causes a justified Southern reluctance to use available innovations. Often Southerners will say, thank you very much. No, we don't want to use this innovation. Let me give you a concrete example. There is a technology used in coal-fired power plants, which is called ultra-supercritical technologies. The technology was developed and patented by a Japanese company called Matsui Babcock, and they charged $1.5 million for a license to use that technology in a 600 megawatt boiler in a coal-fired power plant. It is a very good technology that greatly reduces the pollution that is caused by creating electricity from coal. Now, Chinese power companies, they paid the $1.5 million, Harbin Electric, for example. They equipped all their coal-fired power plants with this new technology, paying $1.5 million for each 600 megawatt boiler. Indian power companies said, no, thank you. We will use the old supercritical and subcritical technologies for our coal-fired power plants. We will not pay you these $1.5 million. We will rather create more pollution. Now, this is very bad for Indian people, right? You have a lot more pollution than is necessary because you are building brand new coal-fired power plants that are not using the latest available technology. And that's a very bad effect of this kind of a patent system that hikes up the price of using the latest new technologies. That's a cost on all of humankind, because all of humankind will have to deal with the additional CO2, the additional emissions that come from coal-fired power plants operated in India. The final bad effect of the existing regime is ignored externalities. Innovators are rewarded through buyers' decisions, and therefore they largely ignore effects on third parties that potential buyers care little about. So I ignore the effects, which would come to people other than the buyer if the buyer doesn't care about those people. And that leads to substantial underinvestment in innovations that have large positive externalities. And again, in green technologies and vaccines, that is very, very common. So think of a factory owner who decides whether to pay extra to use a certain green technology that reduces pollution. The factory owner will be sensitive to the impact on himself, will be sensitive to the impact on his or her employees, potentially. Let's hope that is true. But the typical factory owner will not care about future generations, will not care about the people in the wider world, and therefore will not be willing to pay a lot for that pollution reducing equipment. And that in turn means that innovators will not produce that kind of innovation that would lead to great benefits that are widely diffused across humankind and across future generations. They are under-incentivized, basically. Okay, so these are drawbacks of the patent regime. And when you mention to people these 4 important drawbacks of the patent regime, people will say, but without well-enforced monopolies, innovators would be unable to recover their R&D investment and innovation would dry up. So patents are much, much better than a world without patents. So that is true in a sense. But it's also very deeply false, because the patent versus no patent, these are not the only 2 alternatives. There are other ways in which we could reward and incentivize innovation, and that's what we should be thinking about. Are there alternatives to patents? Of course, innovation has to be incentivized, but for God's sake, not with patents. Try something better. And what I want to recommend to you are sector-specific impact funds, basically impact rewards, where we reward innovations according to the overall social benefits that are produced with them. We cannot get rid of the patent system, unfortunately. If I could remake it all, I would love to do that. But it's very likely that that is politically unfeasible. But what we can do is we can offer innovators an alternative. If you give up your patent privileges on a specific innovation in a specific region, we will reward you according to the impact achieved with your innovation in that region. That is the basic idea. That is politically feasible. So we would replace hereby the conventional headwind against diffusion, which is monopoly markups, with a tailwind aiding diffusion, an extra payment that supplements the sale price. So instead of having to sell their product at a higher price in order to pay the royalties and licensing fees to innovators, in this case, the sellers of innovations would be able to sell the product at a lower price, because they are not only getting the sales price, but in addition to the sales price, they get an impact reward, a reward that is conditioned on the overall pollution reduction that is achieved by the particular product that is being sold. So this would promote global justice, especially for technologies that are geared to poor populations and tropical regions, because here impact funds would open whole new areas of technology that would suddenly be worthwhile to research. It would be because we don't depend on charging high prices of the poor people who would be using these innovations. We could sell it to them cheaply, and the innovator would get paid not so much through the sales price, but mainly through the impact reward that is based on the pollution reduction achieved through the use of this technology. We would accelerate the overall pace of innovation, especially in regard to those technologies suitable for the poor people and tropical regions. And we would expand capacities in the global south to develop, manufacture, distribute, deploy, operate, maintain, and repair relevant technologies. The idea of impact rewards is a kind of meta innovation. It's an innovation in how we incentivize and reward innovations. And they can work in any sector for which we can formulate a uniform metric of freedom-relevant social value. The most important such sectors are pharmaceuticals and green technologies. In pharmaceuticals, especially vaccines, which are under-incentivized under the present system, and green technologies, where again, the benefit from using a green technology are very diffuse. They benefit all people in the world. They benefit non-human species. They benefit future generations. And therefore, the present system greatly under-incentivizes their development and their diffusion. Agriculture and education, I won't go into it, but there are other areas in which we could make great progress. So what I am recommending in particular is the creation of an ecological impact fund that is meant to accelerate green innovation development for and green innovation uptake in the global south. The Ecological Impact Fund would invite patentees to register any new green technology with two effects in all countries below a certain annual per capita income, including India, of course. The EIF would reward each registered technology for 5 years for pollution averted with it in this EIF zone. And the originator would grant permanent royalty-free licenses in the EIF zone for its registered technology. Basically, the innovator would trade in its patent privileges for impact rewards. The Ecological Impact Fund would attract registrations of green innovations that develop to earn patent income in the north, can in the EIF zone earn much more money with impact rewards than with monopoly rents. It would also attract registrations from green innovations that are developed specifically to meet the needs of EIF zone populations. That is what I said earlier. Whole new areas of innovation would open up, areas of innovation where nobody has innovated so far, because you cannot squeeze monopoly rents out of poor people. EIF rewards would be paid through fixed annual disbursements of pre-announced size, initially perhaps something like $3 to $4 billion annually, with possible scale-up. So any new green technology can be registered to participate in 5 consecutive years in these disbursements. So you would participate for 5 years, you would get a share of the large disbursement, and your share would depend on your share in the impact achieved. So if your innovation is registered and is responsible for 2% of the ecological impact of all the registered innovations in that year, then for that year, you get 2% of the disbursement of the $3 to $4 billion. that would repeat 5 times. And at the end of 5 years, you would have had your reward and your innovation goes generic. It becomes free to be copied and used by anybody in the global south. In the global north, nothing would change. Everything would remain the same. They can stick to their patent system. It's the global south that we need to attack and where we need to achieve ecological progress. Now, I think the EIF is politically realistic because it's optional for both innovators and funders. Nobody is forced down that road. Any innovator can insist on their patent privileges if they so choose. It's an option they have to make even more money by registering their innovation with the Ecological Impact Fund. And it requires only a small fraction of the 300 billion per annum that was promised for climate finance. Remember, this was promised in Azerbaijan. The rich countries said they would, they first promised it in Copenhagen in 2009. They didn't quite achieve it. That they promised $100 billion a year. Now they promised $300 billion a year by 2035. The way that money is spent is really pretty much smoke and mirrors. 3/4 of the money is spent on loans, which have to be repaid and which increase the heavy debt burden, especially in Africa. 93% of the money overlaps with official development assistance. It's essentially double counted. So they spend $116 billion on climate finance, $211 billion on official development assistance. And the total of these two amounts is $219 billion because of all the double counting. And what's really worst of all is that in tracking that money, all they look at is how much money is spent, and nobody looks at the impact. So long as it's spent somehow on green climate finance, it counts, even if the impact is quite minimal. So what I want to say to world leaders is, let's spend at least $4 billion a year in a really effective way. And that would make a much bigger difference than this much larger amount of climate finance that the rich countries have promised. You can see here that pretty much the largest share of global climate finance goes to India. India gets $14.2 billion in global climate finance. But as I also said, unfortunately, a lot of that money is very poorly spent. You can imagine rich countries very often, they simply try to give it to consultants in their own country, to companies in their own country. So they call up a local company and they say, can you do something nice in India? Something that is green in some way in India. And it doesn't matter how effective it is. It would be nice if the money went to a local firm, one of our firms, a German firm, a French firm, a US firm, because then we have employment in our country, we have tax revenues in our country, and we do a little something for the greening of our planet. Now, financing the EIF, the initial money would have to come from states, but that state money could be complemented and eventually even replaced by contributions from a capital endowment that we could build steadily over time, from treaty-based state contributions, bequests, donations by firms, foundations, and philanthropists. And in the end, that's what I hope will happen, that we have an endowment for the EIF that makes the EIF independent from the goodwill of states, because funding decisions by states are always iffy and contingent, and we want the EIF to be a stable part of the international institutional architecture. Good, I have an appendix, but I think I will leave it here because we need to leave some time for discussion, I hope, and I can answer any further questions in the discussion. Thank you for your attention. Good. I'm not hearing anything. Should I? Is there anybody chairing the discussion, or how do we go on? I'm happy to take any questions if anybody has any, but we should have a moderator, right? Some sort of a chair or. Okay, so let me see what we can do here. I think the problem is that I have become the host somehow, and that I need to grant some permissions or something like that. Let me see whether I can do that. Okay, maybe if those who want to speak can raise their hand, then I can see whether I can unmute them. Can you raise your hand? Okay. So I've
Professor
tried to.
Pogge, am I
Yes.
audible?
Yes, now you're audible. Excellent.
Yes.
So
Uh, Actually, I made you the host and you were not able to transfer the hosting. That's the reason I was unmuted.
I see. Yeah, so you have made somebody the host who is not a super techno star on Zoom.
Actually, because
I'm
you were sharing the slides, that's the reason I want.
right. But can I make you the host? And if so, how? If I can just give it back to you, I would be very happy.
You can tap on my name and there you'll get the option to make me the host. My name is Muhammad Siddiqui.
Yeah, I know what your name is, but let me see whether I can find you in some way here. Make host. Wow.
Yes, got the hosting.
At
Thank you.
last. Okay.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Professor Pogge, for the enlightening and thought-provoking words. With this, now we open the floor for the questions, and I request everyone to keep their questions concise and to the point, so that as many as uh, possible voices can be heard. So, Professor Pogge, thank you once again, and we now move into the Q&A session. You can raise your hand one by one. Let me see. Okay. Yeah, Santosh. Santosh, you can ask the question.
Yes. Am I audible?
You are
Hello?
audible to me.
Yes, sir. Nice. Sir, thank you for the insightful presentation. Actually, it was very insightful and thought-provoking. I wanted to ask you, is there any country which took a step forward in implementing EAF? If so, how effective it is?
Very good question. Yeah, I have spent the last year, I was on leave last year. So I had a break from Yale for 1 year, and I've spent that year really pushing very hard for the Ecological Impact Fund. And India is an important country in this context because India, during its G20 leadership, that's where the EIF idea was born, and that's where, together with Indian colleagues, especially RIS and Sachin Chaturvedi, we worked on it, and we injected it into the G20 process. Also, last year I was in South Africa. I did a side event on it, again trying to get it on the G20 agenda. I've been to Brazil, where I presented it on the invitation of the Chief Justice of the highest court of Brazil. He allowed me to, in his courtroom, to present it in the presence of a lot of the COP people from the foreign ministry and so on. So Brazil at least gave me a forum. They have their own idea that they are pushing, but they are sympathetic to the EIF. I've spent several longish visits in India, in China. China is an important country because it is by far the largest polluter today. And I think it would be very important for China to contribute to the funding of the EIF. And I'm there in contact with the Belt and Road Initiative. They have a section that deals with global climate funding. And I hope very much that we can get China to make a financial contribution to it. We have Thanksgiving coming up. I will travel to Germany then. Germany has not been sympathetic, I should say, my home country. I will also go in December to Scandinavia, where Norway and Sweden are countries that might contribute. The amount, if you think about it, if we start the EIF with $3 or $4 billion annually, that is chicken shit. That's a very small amount of money, you know, in the larger scheme of things. Just think of all the money that is now being spent on AI, that is in the trillions of dollars. And we should, to save our planet, to really make a huge difference to ecological harm and to the ability of poor people to contribute to solving this great problem for humanity, we should certainly be willing to spend that amount of money. So I really hope that we can get it together. But again, there are considerable headwinds, in particular, Trump and his allies, who think that the whole problem of ecological harm is a hoax, and who think that we should just make this planet safe for billionaires and ignore the problems of everybody else. And he has his followers, and I'm certainly not counting on any contribution from the United States in the near future, or from some of the other countries that are having like-minded governments. But we don't need everybody. We need a few countries that are willing to guarantee a contribution for the next few years. And that would be enough to get the EIF going. I envisage that we do a pilot first, a 2-year pilot of the EIF that shows the proof of concept, measurability, and so on, and then go to implementation full scale on at $3 or $4 billion a year.
Thank you. That answers my question.
Okay, you're muted, Mohammed. Mohammed, you're muted. You have to unmute yourself.
Okay. Am I audible?
Yes, now you are.
Thank you, Santosh, for asking. Now, Sachin, you can ask the question. I've unmuted you.
Thank you, sir, for the insightful session. My question is, what advice you will give for a 21-year-old Indian to how to better manage finances, given there is a rising inequality around the world and in India too?
So you want to get advice about what you should do for your own sake, or for what you should do to work on the problem of inequality? Can you clarify? You are muted.
Sachin, are you there?
Yeah, he's muted. Sachin, can you unmute yourself and just clarify whether you are seeking advice for yourself or advice for how you can contribute to the political changes that we need.
Sir, for contribution.
Yeah, so a lot depends on what your special talents are and what your special qualifications are. So there isn't, I think, a one-size-fits-all answer to what you are asking. Obviously, one thing that you could do is go into politics and try to work on the intra-national inequality in India, right? I think that India has severely increased inequality in over the last 40 years or so. This was not just the BJP, it was even preceding that. But that inequality has to be gradually reduced in order also to strengthen politically the lower classes, the lower segments, the poorer segments of the Indian population. And that can today be done. It's quite feasible in India for two reasons. One is that India is on a pretty fast growth path. So economic growth, last time I looked, is somewhere in the 6 to 7% per annum range. And a fast-growing economy, there's always more opportunity to change the distribution, to make sure that a little more than a proportional share goes to the poor, that the poor, in other words, are catching up. The other thing that has happened in India recently is that the technologies have improved considerably. So there is a widespread use of electronic payments. You know, you pay with your phone and things like that. That makes it much easier to affect the distribution of income. For example, to challenge money to poor population segments efficiently, safely, corruption-free, and that in turn should be exploited. These technological opportunities should be exploited to shift the distribution of income, to make it less lopsided and shift the distribution of income in favor of India's poor. And again, you know, if you play a political role, you can change that, but you could also, if you were particularly scientifically inclined and technology savvy, you could try to make a difference by innovating further in that area in order to facilitate the kind of changes in the income distribution that India needs. I think India could grow even faster and be even more successful by reaching out to its poorer population segments and making sure that their potential creative energies are fully integrated into India's progress. That is something that China has pretty successfully done in the last 40 years or so. It has especially emphasized education in rural areas and so on. And things like that have really a great payoff, not immediately, but within a few years, a great payoff in accelerating progress throughout the country. And I think India has great potential in that regard.
Next, I'll request Sachin Yadav. He's a student of Center for Political Studies here in Jawaharlal Nehru University. So Sachin, you can ask what question you have.
Try to unmute yourself. I think that would help. Yeah.
Am I audible? Am I audible,
Yes, you
Siddiqui?
are.
Yes, you are.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Pogge, for such an insightful session. You have covered elaborately 3 chapters, including the structure of free society, poverty, and innovation. So, Professor Pogge, I have just two small questions to ask. First question is regarding that you have also discussed about the competitive freedom. So my first question is regarding that how can society rebalance institutional and innovation in institutional and infrastructural system to actively promote more equitable competitive freedom for both privileged as well as marginalized group. My first question is that. My second question is regarding the patent. Sir, Professor, how might the current structure of patent and innovation insensitive to be reformed to prioritize research on disease of poverty and the needs of poor population instead of lucrative but non-essential markets? Thanks, Sidhu.
Yeah, I have had a little difficulty understanding you, but I think I understand the basics of the question. So the first one was rebalancing freedom, right? Rebalancing between the rich and the poor in particular. And here I think the economic inequality is the lever that we can most easily move. We can try to reduce income inequalities, and that will also reduce political inequalities and social inequalities and educational inequalities and so on. Economic inequality is quite foundational in that regard. The other thing that we can do is we can try to insulate the political process better from the economy. So that is a problem in India. It's a greater problem in the United States, I should say, where notoriously politics is totally up for sale, right? But India has that problem to some extent, that rich people have disproportionate opportunities to influence politics in all sorts of different ways, and we can try to reduce that influence to some extent. The second question that you asked had to do with patents. How can we make it the case that innovators pay more attention to the needs of the poor? And here, the impact fund idea or the impact rewards idea is precisely supposed to do that. So if you measure the health impact of particular drugs, particular medical interventions like drugs or vaccines or something like that, you measure that in terms of quality adjusted life years. That's a standard measure for health outcomes. And here you would simply reward the innovator on the basis of the health gains that are achieved with its medicine. And here the health gains would be measured completely independently, of course, of the income and wealth of the person who experiences these gains. So if you lengthen the life of a very poor person by 2 years, that is getting you the same reward as lengthening the life of a very rich person by 2 years. And that equalization of incentives, that you have equal incentives regardless of whose health you improve, that would have the effect that you counterbalance the typical skewing that we now have, that the health of rich people counts for much, much more, because rich people can pay these high markups for medicines and poor people cannot. So this would be a system that would automatically equalize the concern that innovators have for innovating something that can promote the health of poor people versus rich people. Simply the reward system.
Professor Pogge, we have 6 more hands. So should I ask 3 questions at one go or one by one?
I would say one by one makes more sense, unless we are very pressed for time, but it typically doesn't pay to put them all together, because in the end it takes as much time as doing them one by one, and it's clearer for everybody to get the answer right away to the question, rather than to have to try to remember all these different questions and then to see which answer belongs to which question.
Oh, okay, sure. So, Vivo, you can ask the question.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. First of all, good evening, sir. You delivered a wonderful session for us. Sir, I would like to ask if a young man like me who want to do something for this climate crisis, how can I change it, sir? If it requires a revolution, we are ready. kindly guide us. How can we bring a change? As the climate crisis is already going very high and the window is closing very fast. So what I can do and how I can join more people who can bring this change?
Mhm. Yeah, very good question. And I think that the question gets me to a prior question, namely, why haven't we solved this problem? This is the first thing we all need to think about, right? We have known about this climate crisis for 40 years, and we have made zero progress. In 2024, the world has consumed more coal than in any previous year, more oil than in any previous year, more natural gas than in any previous year, and the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere has increased in 2024 by more than in any previous year. So we have made no progress at all. And don't let anybody tell you otherwise. So why not? The reason is, I think, that there are very deeply entrenched interests, in particular by those people and governments and institutions that own the fossil fuels that are still in the ground. Everybody, even sweet, nice little Norway, is saying, yes, yes, a lot of that stuff needs to stay in the ground, but not mine. Mine has to be dug out. Mine has to be extracted. Mine has to be used. Mine should not go to waste. And so they lobby very heavily for subsidies on fossil fuels, which are still $7 trillion a year in subsidies for fossil fuels. Madness. So that's what we are up against. And what we, the people like you and me who are fighting this, what we are doing wrong is we are not united enough. We fight battles here and there against this pipeline and against that project, and we do this and we do that. We are not united. That's what is the biggest deficit. We need to unite behind one compelling, really important reform and push it through really hard, get it through. And I think my candidate is the EIF. I think that would make a huge difference. And it would be the first domino in a whole sequence of falling dominoes. If we can get this through, we could get other impact funds adopted potentially once we have the model. And we could also then unite forces behind other ideas that would also seriously reduce the ecological harm that we are doing to our planet. We are demoralized largely. A lot of people who are in the environmental movement are there basically for recreation. They say, I like the people who are involved in the environment. I like to be part of a movement, part of a group, but they are not seriously politically fighting against climate change. They have been demoralized by too many defeats. And so I hope that I can mobilize enough support for the Ecological Impact Fund to push that through and thereby to remoralize everybody. Say, look, big, real changes can be done. This doesn't have to be an annual talking shop only. We can achieve something, and this is the beginning of a sequence of changes, a sequence of reforms that will, within short order, really dramatically reduce the emissions, the global emissions from fossil fuels. So support
Tanisha,
the Impact Fund. That's the message.
Tanisha, you can ask the question.
Yeah.
Good evening, sir. So my
Yep.
question to you is, how can governments effectively use progressive taxation to strengthen climate finance, especially in the face of rising global challenges such as widening income inequalities, etc. And there is also limited fiscal space in developing economies. So how can government do that?
Yeah, excellent question. We are heavily involved in that question. And there are two big ideas, I think, that come to mind first and foremost. The first one is that we have to tax the income of billionaires. astonishingly enough, billionaires are able to escape almost all taxation on their income. And the reason is that typically they receive their income in the form of capital gains. So you have a rich billionaire who owns shares in or a fraction of a huge company, and that share becomes more and more valuable. But since the shares are not sold, there's never any taxes paid. And what people have proposed, this is in particular ICRICT, which is a group of inequality experts under Stiglitz and Jayati Ghosh, who is an Indian economist. They are the chair and co-chair of that organization. They have proposed a tax, which is a tax that an income tax on billionaires that would attribute to billionaires 2% of their wealth as income. If they already pay taxes on that amount, income taxes on that amount, they don't have to pay anything extra. But if they pay less than that, less than the tax, the income tax that would be payable on 2% of their wealth each year, then the increment, the shortfall, would have to be taxed as well. So it's a kind of tax on billionaires, which could be extended to centimillionaires, i.e. people who have more than $100 million in wealth. And that would be a very significant way of raising the money. The person who has developed this tax is Gabriel Zuckman, Z-U-C-M-A-N, and ICRICT, E-C-R, no, ICRICT, yeah, E-C-R-I-C-T, I think. That is the organization. You can look that up. The second thing that I would strongly recommend is a very tiny financial transaction tax, a tax of maybe just 1/10 or 0.5% on all financial transactions, meaning people buying stock and selling stock, buying options and derivatives and commodities and all these financial instruments. It would be imperceptible for the people trading these things. And of course, these people are by and large rich people that are trading these things. It would be perceptible only for these very fast traders that go in and out very often. That sort of trading would be diminished a little bit, but it would also raise fantastic sums of money because many hundreds of trillions of dollars, just absolutely insane amounts of money, are transacted in the markets each day, in stock trading, commodity trading, derivatives trading, and so on. And if we could siphon off just an incredibly small part of that, we would, again, get very large amounts of money that we could use for providing social support, poverty eradication programs, and so on. So those would be my two preferred means, and I think these could very easily be implemented. They, of course, are opposed by the small numbers of people that would pay the majority of these taxes, but we should push them through regardless and raise that money. Thanks for the good question. Yash Sharma.
Yes, you can ask the question.
Yes, sir. Sir, my question is how can we talk about inclusive growth when a huge demand skill mismatch persists in India and corporation easily can fly while the poor stay grounded itself? Thank you, sir.
I didn't quite understand it. Poor people stay grounded. Was that metaphorical, or are you saying that poor people do not have access to flying planes, or what are you saying?
Yes, could you please repeat the question?
Mohammed, if you have a clear idea what the question is, maybe you can repeat it. I'm not sure whether
Sir, my question is around the demand skill mismatch. In India, we have the dream of inclusive growth, but there is a huge demand skill mismatch when it comes to employment as well. And
Demands mismatch. Yeah.
yes, sir. And sir, the corporations, they have the money and they can fly and invest in other countries as well. But the poor, like medium and small industries are in India, they are still living in a small part of India on just a one state, two state. How can they grow and contribute to the
Yeah.
whole community?
Yeah. Excellent. Yeah, very good question. Now I
Thank you,
understand
sir.
it. So one thing that is very important in this context is, again, taxation. So there are multinational corporations operating in India, and these multinational corporations, for the most part, do not pay any taxes in India or pay only minimal taxes in India. How is that possible? That's possible because multinational corporations can shift around their profits from one subsidiary to another, right? A multinational corporation, by definition, is a corporation that has subsidiaries in many parts of the world, in many different countries. And these subsidiaries trade with each other. About 30% of world trade is trade within the same company, within the same conglomerate. This trade, the purpose of it very often is to shift profits from high tax jurisdictions into low tax jurisdictions. So multinational corporations, they will loan money from one subsidiary to the other, or they will provide consulting services from one subsidiary to another. So if a multinational corporation has profits in India, it will say, okay, we will hire consultants from another subsidiary of the same multinational, a consultant who is sitting in the British Virgin Islands. And we will pay that person money for being available to be consulted. Or we will put our intellectual property rights into the Netherlands, and we will then pay money from the Indian subsidiary to the Netherlands subsidiary for the right to use the trademark or to use the intellectual property. So that means that multinational subsidiaries of multinational corporations in India are competing at a great advantage against local firms. This was exactly what you were pointing out. It's very difficult for local firms who cannot escape taxation to compete with subsidiaries of multinational firms who can escape taxation. And here, I think it would be very important for India to find a way to prevent this profit shifting. Ideally, that would be done through tax reform, which we are now trying to move to the United Nations. International tax reform has traditionally been handled by the OECD, which is a club of rich countries very much biased in favor of the rich countries and their multinational corporations. If we can shift that to the UN, and if we can insist on regulating international taxing rights more equitably, so that India isn't deprived of the taxes that it should by rights receive from subsidiaries of multinational corporations, then this unfair advantage of multinational firms over domestic firms could be dramatically reduced. I don't see any other way. It's difficult to do. It is in progress now. Again, ICRIT plays an important role, that organization headed by Stiglitz and Gorst. And we have to push that through the UN and try to reduce the tax avoidance that is very ably practiced by multinational corporations, so that Indian companies, purely uninational Indian companies and multinational corporations, compete on an equal footing in Indian markets.
Zahur, you can ask the question. Wait, I'm unmuting. Zahur, I have unmuted you.
Okay, am I audible?
Yes,
Yes.
you are audible.
Okay. Thank you, Poggy, for this wonderful as well as important presentation on this important theme. I'm much interested in poverty as the freedom. So let me be very short. And while considering your discussion on these two themes as well. So I have the following two small questions. One, would relieving poverty promote freedom? While you were, discussing the Kantian, but I would like to, see how. I would like to see your points on this particular question. And the second one is related to the first one. That is, does this freedom require democracy? So, if yes, and what kind of democracy and or what kind of freedom it would be? Thank you, Pogi, again for this insightful presentation.
Yeah. What you are asking goes to the very heart of the lecture. This is what this lecture was about, to say that the greatest freedom deficits in our world are connected to poverty. It is because people are poor that they suffer a much restricted freedom. They have much less freedom as poor people than what they could have. And that is true in all three dimensions of freedom that are distinguished. They have a much restricted option space. They have a much restricted space in terms of their long-term life ambitions, the professions that they can aspire to occupy, for example. If you are born into a poor family in India, many professions are out of reach for you. You don't have the education, you don't have even the ambition to aspire to these things. And then finally, and that was the second part of your question, you also have much diminished opportunities to participate in the political decision making that is very important for shaping the conditions under which you live, the way your municipality is structured, the way your province is structured, and so on. Democracy is hugely important. Democracy is really the only mechanism that we know for how we can aggregate the views, the judgment, and the will of the population, and how we can give everybody a fair chance to be heard and to weigh in, to influence decisions that are of common concern. How to structure in the four senses of structure that are outlined at the beginning, how to structure our local environment, our town, our village, our county, and how to structure our country, the India at large, and even the wider world. And here, democracy is, of course, much more than simply the right to vote. It is the possibility to participate in deliberation, to influence the agenda. All these things are crucially important, and that's where often the most important decisions are being made, right? The decision whether you vote for the A party or the B party is typically of very minor significance. What is really important is who are the candidates of these parties? What are the party programs? What are the debates on the basis of which people make their choice whom to vote for? And in all these ways, poor people are very largely excluded. By the time poor people come in at best, namely at the voting booth, all the important decisions, or many of the important decisions, have already been made. And we want poor people to be better integrated. Now, that requires in particular, better education on the part of poor people. And it also requires, of course, that you have the time that you can invest in trying to engage in political discussions, in making your voice heard. You have to be educated enough to formulate your needs and your demands on others. And you have to have enough leisure time so that you can integrate and inject these demands into the political process. So these are the things that are missing, and these are the things that I think we could focus on in trying to genuinely democratize India by giving participation opportunities, genuine participation opportunities to poor people.
Suchi, you can ask the question, and I think this is the last question of the session. So after that, we'll wind up after the final vote of thanks. Suchi, over to you. I think Suchi, are you there? Oh,
Suchi
okay,
is there. We get a thumb, but you have to unmute yourself or be unmuted.
I think she doesn't want to ask the question.
No, that's unlikely. Really?
James raised his hand, so let's.
So, James, can you unmute?
James.
Yes, sir. Am I audible?
Yes.
Sir, my question is, given the persistence of poverty and inequality, both globally and within nations, our discussions often focus on institutional or tax-related reforms within the existing neoliberal political economic framework. However, Marxist or communist thinkers often argue for replacing this neoliberal system altogether with a global communist alternative. So, what is your perspective on this, sir?
So my perspective is that we should indeed, exactly as Marxists are saying, we should focus on structure. But I don't think we should try to make an enormous jump into a completely different structure that is not politically realistic. And it is also fraught with very obvious dangers and risks. What we should try to do is do important structural reforms while we keep the rest of the structuring of our society in place. So the Ecological Impact Fund, which I just introduced to you, is exactly the kind of idea that I think we should pursue. So when you think about capitalism, capitalism is not an economic system, but it is a family of economic systems, a very wide, large family. And you can see that by just looking at the capitalist countries in the world today. Brazil is very different from Norway, for example, very differently organized. China is a capitalist country, except in word, and is also very differently organized from Brazil and Norway. So there's a wide range of possibilities. And what we want to do is to reform capitalist institutions, the structure of a capitalist society, in a way that makes it more egalitarian and thereby makes it strengthens the poor and distributes power more widely and makes it possible then to make further reforms. Maybe in the long run, we want to go into a very different kind of society, maybe a communist society or whatever. But the way to get there is simply to take steps in the direction of greater equality, greater participation, and of course, eradicating poverty, giving poor people, everybody, a real chance to participate in politics. So it is these steps where we repair the ship, so to speak, while we are afloat on the ocean, plank by plank, step by step, that are promising. And that has happened in the last 40, 50 years in reverse. Capitalist systems have been changed, have been made worse and worse through piecemeal reforms, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, steps have been taken to empower the richest 1%, giving them more favorable regulations, more favorable tax regimes, more favorable international rules that make them more able to exploit people in other countries and so on. And we have to play that same game and try to reverse these deteriorations of international institutions and bend structures in favor of making them more egalitarian. And as we succeed at that, as we take the first few steps, we will get stronger and stronger. On the one hand, because the demoralizing effect of the changes of the last few years or few decades will be reversed. We'll no longer be demoralized because we see that there's some real successes. And second, also, because our natural allies, namely people at the bottom end of the income and wealth distribution, will become stronger and stronger as their poverty is alleviated.
Nayan, you can ask the question.
So am I audible?
Yes, you are.
So thank you very much, Professor. So taking from James Scott's Seeing Like a State, where he criticized the high modernism leading towards homogenization and destroying the local knowledge that Scott called the mythist. My question concerns the universality of the principle of innovation you invoked here. Are we not heading towards the fear Scott cautioned us against? Because it seems that you are arguing about the resource distribution, and in this process, the poor communities will give up their local cultures and knowledge to resource distribution current economic order. Thank you.
Yeah, I have not understood every word you said, but I think I get the gist of it. I mean, you're basically concerned about the local knowledge, local cultures being destroyed or undermined through modernization. And I'm not sure this is closely related to the topic of this lecture. I think that if you think about the Ecological Impact Fund, for example, it would be very open to local solutions and to locally appropriate solutions, would reward them in accordance to their impact just as much as other technological solutions that might be globally applicable. But I have recently participated in a book project about mountain tourism, which is quite interesting in this context, where we did think very hard about how you can create a pattern of mountain tourism in regions that are quite remote, that would preserve the local culture, but also allow tourist income to improve the economic condition of the locals. So you don't want mass tourism, you don't want big mass tourist companies to invade the area to build 5-star hotels and so on. And even for the sake of a special type of tourist, you want to preserve the area as much as possible in its natural state and allow a small number of tourists to enjoy the area as it really was, with minimal impact of the tourists. So that's maybe something to look at. I think it's a different problem from the problem that we are discussing today, but I'm very sympathetic to it. And I think that it is a great source of richness of the world that we have all these different countries. And of course, it's a commonplace to say that India is the most diverse country in the world. It has an amazing plurality of languages, of cultures, and you can never get tired of it. Traveling in India, you will come into new universes almost, and incredible landscapes, incredible communities of people who live quite differently from other communities. So India is a world upon itself, and absolutely we want to preserve that. And it is an important part of preserving this that we eradicate poverty and make these communities able to sustain themselves and to preserve their culture through, I mean, having the resources to do so.
Suji, you can ask the question. After that,
Yes.
we have Anamika, and we'll wind up after that.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah. Namaste, sir. First of all, thank you so much for this brilliant session. My question is, during the lecture, we focused on two terms, the core and the periphery. And we see in the contemporary world that the developing countries and the developing countries and the underdeveloped countries are still living on the discarded technologies of the developed countries. And also, the developing countries are still in a constant battle to get into the core. In this context, such countries are falling behind in ecological conservation and poverty. Also, the governments are failing to entertain big companies, MNCs. So, what is your point, and what do you suggest us um, to balance this ecological conservation, poverty, along with development?
Mhm.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, so your observation is completely right, and the Ecological Impact Fund is addressing part of that problem. So what happens now is that innovators in the green technology space, they are focusing on innovations that rich people would potentially buy, right? So, and these are innovations that are needed in the rich countries first and foremost. So you develop innovations for the rich countries, and then once you have the innovation developed, you make money through collecting monopoly rents from customers in rich countries predominantly. But you also have a look at the poorer countries, at the developing countries, and you say, oh, maybe this innovation of mine can also be sold there. And maybe I don't charge quite as much of a markup. I sell them a little cheaper in those countries. I can still make money. But what is being innovated, the innovations that come onto the market, that is very heavily shaped by the needs and interests and preferences of people in the richer country, exactly as you said. Now, the Ecological Impact Fund aims to change that. The Ecological Impact Fund says that we will pay you on the basis of ecological impact. And so it doesn't matter whether poor people use that or rich people use it, whoever deploys that innovation and achieves ecological impact by so deploying it, a reward will be paid to the innovator. So now suddenly it becomes economically feasible and lucrative to develop innovations, green innovations, specifically targeted to poor people. Now, so long as poor people can more or less pay for the cost of the product, there need not be any markup, because the markup, the profit for the innovator that allows the innovator to recoup their innovation expenses, that comes out of the impact reward. So you can have, for example, a filtration system that protects the health of poor people from pollution, very needed in India these days. So you have a system like that, some maybe a personal device, or maybe something that you can install in the apartment where you live, that poor people could buy. It would improve their health. It would have a health impact, and a poor person would not be expected to pay anything extra for that health impact. That would be paid for by the Ecological Impact Fund. And so it would suddenly become lucrative to think, to put yourself into the shoes of very poor consumers and say, what do they need? What do they want? What is in their best interest? What can I offer them that would have a big health impact, or that would have an impact on the emissions that poor people produce? Probably the former is much more interesting than the latter, because poor people contribute very little to pollution these days. So the health of poor people would suddenly become a profit center where innovators could harvest rewards, despite the fact that poor people have very little money themselves, because they wouldn't pay the reward. The reward would come out of the Ecological Impact Fund.
Anamika, this is the last question, Professor. So after that, we'll wind up with a vote of thanks and we'll set you free.
Touche, yeah.
Wait a second, let me unmute. Anamika, I have unmuted. Anamika, are you there? Yes, she's there.
She's there and she's unmuted as far as I can see, but she's
Yeah,
not talking.
now I have unmuted. Hello, sir.
Yeah, hello.
Yeah, my question is simple, sir. That that justify the statement which says a free society cannot exist without check and balances.
Yeah, what cannot exist without checks and balances?
A free society cannot exist without check and balance.
Yeah. And you want me to comment on that?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I mean, checks and balances, that's a very complicated topic, of course. But in principle, I think the remark is certainly right. You do want a political system in which you prevent a minority from running away with the decision making, right? This is a little bit what we have in the US today. We have a pretty strong and heavily empowered presidency that is making all sorts of decisions that are not properly checked and vetted by the larger populations, and in particular by the representatives of the people in the Congress and the Senate. Decisions like, for example, bombing supposed drug smugglers in the Caribbean. That's one thing that he's doing. He's using drone strikes in various countries. In Africa, for example, in Somalia, we are undertaking these drone strikes and so on. So we do need, of course, an executive that is able to act, but we need that executive to be checked. And we need to make sure that different parts of government balance each other. That is something that we have learned through long and bitter experience. And of course, that is entirely correct. And here, a very, very important role is played by the judicial system that has to be independent. There are problems about the independence of the judicial system in the US these days, as you probably saw, with several Supreme Court justices being all too willing to do Trump's bidding. And you have similar problems in India as well. Again, I know less about India than about this country, but in India too, maybe the judiciary is sometimes too willing to rubber stamp the initiatives of the executive. It's very important to preserve a level playing field, the essence of democratic institutions, which, as I said in response to an earlier question, is not just voting, but it is all the different paraphernalia of democracy, agenda setting, deliberation, and so on. All of that needs to be preserved. And there will always be a tendency of people who are strong in the political process at a particular time to try to shut down this level playing field, to tilt the playing field in their favor, and thereby to lock in, to entrench their current advantage. And that is where we need checks and balances most seriously. We need to prevent that. We need to make sure that the fairness of the political playing field, the possibility for everyone to participate, for every voice to be heard, that is preserved through fluctuations in the power distribution, that people who have more power for the moment cannot use that power to permanently tilt the playing field in their own favor or against their political opponents.
So now I think there are no more questions. So we'll wind up. And thank you, Professor, for this engaging lecture. Now I would like to invite Sachin Yadav for the final vote of thanks. Sachin, are you there?
Yes.
Yes, he's here.
Okay, thank you, Siddiqui. A very good evening to all of you. On the behalf of JNU Lecture Series, it is my profound honor to extend our deepest gratitude to Professor Thomas Pogge for delivering an extraordinary and compelling lecture on structure for a free society. Professor Pogge, your insights today have not merely informed us, they have challenged our assumptions, sharpened our moral imaginations, and encouraged us to reimagine the architecture of justice and institutional responsibility. Your intellectual clarity and unwavering commitment to global equity enriched us in a way that will resonate far beyond this session. You reminded us that a free society is not an accident of history. It is a structure we must consciously build, critique, and sustain. We are grateful for the privilege of learning from you. I extend my heartfelt thanks to all participants who joined us and contributed to the energy of this discussion. Your engagement reflects the vibrant academic spirit that JNU stands for. My sincere appreciation also goes to the organization team of the JNU lecture series. Their dedication and behind the scenes efforts have made today's event seamless and successful. With that, I, Sachin Yadav, the student of Center for Political Studies, respectfully bring this session to a close. Thank you once again. Have a meaningful evening. Thank you, Siddiqui. Thank you, Professor
Namaste.
Pogge.
Namaste to all. Thank you for your good questions.
And Professor, looking forward to
Good luck.
many more lectures ahead and hope you'll come in.
I will definitely come to India again for sure.
Yes,
Looking
we'll
forward
connect.
to it.
Okay. Thank you so much, Professor. Okay, bye. Sachin Yadav.